I've got a question for you. What's the first thing you get told to learn when you buy your first camera? Learn how to take photos in manual mode. Well, here's something that even some professional photographers don't tell you. There's a mode on your camera that gives you full control over your camera settings, but the camera will still expose every photo perfectly and instantly. It's a camera mode that I've used every single day for the last 2 years for all of my wedding photography and my couple photos, giving me a huge advantage when it comes to working quickly and never missing the moment. It's been incredibly easy for me to use, and I'd recommend anybody to give it a go. And this photo mode isn't just limited to portraiture, because I've used it for wildlife, I've also used it for motorsport. This photo mode is literally something anybody can use regardless of whether you're a beginner or even the veterans of photography. So in this video, I'm going to be explaining exactly what that photo mode is and how you can apply it to any photo that you take in the future. This specific mode and the setup of it is available on most of the newer cameras, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be demonstrating everything using my Sony camera, so it may be displayed a little bit different on your camera. And after all of that, I'm going to be showing you one final tip that will make this camera mode even easier to use, especially when you're like me and you do a lot of different types of photography often. But first, I think it's important to understand why people think that manual mode is the better option to begin with, because we can't deny that there are some benefits that manual mode does provide to some photographers. Manual mode is looked at as the expert way to use your camera, and it allows you to control your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture independently to one another. And these three controls will affect the overall exposure of your photo, and you will choose these settings based on your personal preference. And that involves you being very comfortable in understanding exposure, and more importantly, picture this. You're out taking photos somewhere and you see a composition, a moment, something completely unplanned. You raise your camera up and realize you've got to change some of your exposure settings, and by the time you've missed the shot. The moment's gone, and sometimes you will never get that chance again. It does happen. Now let me show you how my camera works, and this may make you change the way you take your photos forever. No matter where I point my camera, it will expose to 0 instantly. I can change my aperture whenever I want, and that will be taken into account. But no matter what I do, the shutter speed will always remain usable, and so will the ISO. So here's the big secret. The mode that I use every single day on my cameras is aperture priority. But wait, hang on. There's more going on behind the scenes than you realize. And what I'm going to show you right now will unlock the endless possibilities of using aperture priority. Hidden away in the menu of your camera are particular settings that you can change to make the camera work within certain boundaries. And setting these boundaries will make your camera deliver perfect results instantly every single time. So grab your camera and follow along. In your menu somewhere, you will find an option for your ISO limits, giving you the ability to set a minimum and maximum point for your ISO when it's set to auto. For me, I always set my minimum limit to be the lowest ISO I can go. So in this case, it would be 100 ISO. And then for the maximum, you can go to whatever ISO you feel comfortable with. For me, I'm pretty happy shooting at 12,800. I would sooner have a grainy image that I can reduce the amount of noise in post, rather than having something where it's a little bit blurry due to a longer shutter speed. You may feel differently, your camera may react differently to higher ISOs. Go with whatever you like, and if you're not sure, do some tests first. Then we need to go back to the menu and find the next setting, which allows you to set the minimum shutter speed when your ISO is set to auto as well. For me, the lowest I would comfortably go to is 1/125th of a second. However, most of the time I go down to 1/250th of a second. Again, there's no rules, go with whatever you feel like. This is photography at the end of the day, and there's no right or wrong answer. The final setting that I change, which is entirely optional, is changing the meter mode to be something that takes into account the entirety of the image. However, you may feel comfortable shooting in a different metering mode, so go with whatever you feel comfortable with. Once you've done that, you are ready to go. Flick your camera into aperture priority mode, change your ISO to auto, and no matter where you point your camera, the camera will take into account the limits that you've just set and do all of the exposing for you instantly. But it's really important to understand what it's doing and why, so you can apply this to other situations when you're doing different types of photography. And straight after that, I'll show you the final tip which will make using these modes even easier. Firstly, with your camera being in aperture priority mode, you're able to choose your aperture based on the subject which you're wanting to be in focus. the same as normal. But now you've given your camera a set of parameters that you're wanting it to stay within, some guidelines. These guidelines have set out what you want it to prioritize up to a certain degree. So in a bright environment, your camera will drop its ISO down to the lowest figure it can whilst remaining within its thresholds. This will obviously reduce the amount of noise in your image, which is exactly what we want. Then to make up any of the exposure it's lost in doing so, it will lengthen the shutter speed up to and including the limit that we've set, in this case 1/250th of a second. For the situations where it's a little bit darker and 1/250th of a second isn't enough to get the exposure to where it needs to be, it will then increase the ISO up to the point where your camera hits the correct exposure, or until the ISO hits the upper limit, whichever comes first. And if your camera does hit that upper limit in the ISO, it will then start lengthening the shutter speed. The only setting you're ever gonna have to change apart from your aperture when taking photos is the exposure value compensation. Most of the time you'll have this set to 0. However, sometimes you may want to increase or decrease this depending on whether you want to retain more highlights or shadows in your overall image. And if at any point you want to find out what your ISO would be if you took a particular photo, you can normally just half press the shutter button and it will flash up on the back of the screen. But what if you're a photographer that enjoys doing different types of photography? I'm using 1/250th of a second, which may be useful for certain types of photography, but if you're doing a type of photography that requires a bit of a faster shutter speed, such as sport or wildlife, what do you do instead of having to go into your settings every single time? You can simply just save these settings as a custom mode on your camera. Then come back to aperture priority, go into the menu and change the limits as you need, perhaps change your shutter speed to something like 1/1000th of a second, and then save that as a second custom mode. Now you can easily go between the two custom modes at a flick of a dial depending on the subject you're taking a photo of. It's that easy. Now this will make taking photos much faster and easier, but it only works in situations where you have constant lighting, such as outside or in a well-lit room. And for situations where you find yourself in the dark, you're gonna have to change it up a little bit, and all you need to know for that is in this video right here. I'll see you soon.